Hello and welcome to our ball bounce tutorial with Squash and Stretch. So we're going to learn today how to make a ball bounce with Squash and Stretch, but we're also going to introduce the concept of hierarchy in Maya. Now hierarchy just means a system of organization, and you'll see if you've seen the other tutorial that I did, we just animated the ball up and down. So we just animated the mesh. But in order to do this, in order to give us the capability to do some additional stuff, we're going to go ahead and create a hierarchy using empty groups. So the way that I created this is I just select the ball and I go up here to edit and I say group. So we'll step through the different groups. You can see that ball rotate, ball squash and stretch, and ball move are all have the ball underneath it. And that's basically what hierarchy is anything underneath the object above it will inherit the transforms of that object. So one of the problems that we have is that when we group something, it automatically sets the pivot point of that object at the origin. So when I had the ball, even though it's resting above the ground plane, and you can see that the center of the ball is at the center of this mass here, when I select ball rotate, the center of the pivot point is at the base of the ball, the origin of the world. So one of the ways that we want to fix this is when we rotate this ball, we don't really want it to rotate around the base of it because it's going to just look strange when it does that. So what we really want to do is we want that ball to rotate around the center of it. So we're going to go up here to modify, and then we're going to go to center pivot. So now you'll see that when I rotate the ball rotate group, it rotates the ball correctly. Now the ball itself is not rotating, it's not getting any of those transforms, but the ball rotate is transforming, and anything underneath it is going to inherit those transforms as well. Ball squash and stretch is going to serve as our scaler, so we're going to put scale on that and learn to squash and stretch the ball. And then ball move is what's going to have the main motion of our ball bouncing. And you can see in the graph editor that I've already created that animation. So if we just step back, you can see if we just run through it, the ball basically bounces up and down, and all of that animation is on the ball move node, but that is then inherited by all of these other things. Now none of these have any animation on them, just the ball move, but because they're underneath the ball move in the hierarchy, they're inheriting it. So what we're going to do today is a simple type of squash and stretch, meaning it's going to be sort of instantaneous. We're not going to hold the ball at the bottom. And we're going to use the ball squash and stretch node to do that. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the timing of the ball squash and stretch is the same as the ball move. So the easy way to do that is we're going to select the ball squash and stretch node, and we're going to select the ball move node at the same time. What you can do is you can just go ahead and hit S, and even though you have no animation on the ball squash and stretch, when you hit S, it creates a key. You can see that over here in our channel box. The channels turn dark red, and it creates a tick mark on our timeline. We're just going to go ahead and select the ball move and ball squash and stretch, and there's a couple different ways to do that. You can use this key down here in your timeline, which is the next forward one key. If you click that, you can see it'll step all the way to the next keyframe. Because we have multiple objects selected, it's showing all of the keyframes on those objects. And because ball move is the only thing that has animation on it, ball squash and stretch is just sort of following along. So what we'll do is we'll go and we'll step to each key and we'll just set a key. So I just hit S, I step to the next key, hit S, step to the next key, S, again and again and again. So simple. What we're doing is we're just setting blank keys on all of the ball squash and stretch node as well. So if we select our ball squash and stretch node, you can see it has no animation, the curves are flat, but it does have keys where we want to be squashing and stretching. So we're going to go ahead and start by adding a stretch. Now what we have to do is we have to think of what the ball is doing, right? This is animation, we're observing life, we're kind of mimicking life in the platform, the 3D platform. And what we want to do is we want to think about what the ball is doing. So right now the ball is sort of at the start point, and the ball is up above, and when it starts to fall, what's happening is gravity, the force of gravity, is acting on that ball and pulling it down to the ground. So as the gravity pulls the ball further and further, that ball is going to stretch. So right here, right before we have the ball hitting the ground, that's what's happening here at frame 10, we're going to take the ball and we're going to stretch it, meaning that we're going to make it longer and taller than it is. So the way that you're going to do this is you're just going to scale it. So we just create our scale node or select our scale object, and we go over here and we stretch it. Now over here in our channel box, we can see it's getting a change of transform. That channel turns dark red. We'll just go ahead and put a numeric value in it. And let's just go arbitrary. We'll just say 1.3, just to pick a number out of the air. Now, since I've already set a key at frame 10, when it hits the ground, it's going to go back to its shape. So we're just working here at frame 9. The problem is that this isn't really squash and stretch. When you just scale an object in one direction, that is not squash and stretch because you're not actually keeping the volume of that object. When an object gets taller, it needs to get thinner in order to maintain its volume, because otherwise it's actually growing. So we've scaled this vertically here in our y-axis. What we need to do is we need to have a corresponding change in our x and our z-axis. When the ball goes up in one axis, the other two axes respond. So we scaled to 1.3 in the y, so let's just go ahead and put in 0.7 and 0.7 in the x and the z. Now this is a pretty extreme stretch. You can see that it's no longer spherical in any way. And you could play around with these numbers. We could make this 0.8 and 0.8. You could calculate it mathematically, but we'll just go ahead and keep these because we're just going for a nice visual appeal here. So the ball is being pulled on by gravity, it's stretching, and then it's hitting this ground plane. Now when it hits the ground plane, you can see that it's smashing into the ground plane here, and the ball itself is spherical here, but what we want to do is we want to counteract this stretch here with a squash. So it's hitting the ground isn't moving. All of that energy of the ball is translating down vertically, and it's going to make the ball shorter. So we'll go ahead and scale this down, and let's just say 0.7. Now, the same way that when we made it taller, it had to get thinner, when we make it shorter, it has to get more round, it has to get wider. So let's go ahead and put the opposite values, 1.3 and 1.3, in our x and our z. So now the ball is falling, it is stretched. When it hits the ground, boom, it squashes. And the next thing that happens is the ball pushes off of the ground and starts to move upward. So what happens is all of this energy that's built up in the ball explodes back upwards and the ball stretches again. So let's go ahead and change this back to 1.3 and 0.7 and 0.7. So ball is falling, it hits the ground, boom, it squashes, it explodes back off the ground, and it stretches. And then as it goes back up to the arc, the top of the arc, the ball is going to regain its shape. It regains its shape because gravity is pulling down on it. You can imagine it's trying to force this ball back down. So it's losing all of that extra energy that it's built up right here in the explosive movement. And then as it falls back down, so we're not going to do anything here at 19, frame 19, which is the apex of the second bounce. At frame 27, the frame right before the ball hits the ground again, we're going to make it stretch. Now, we're not going to make it stretch as much because the ball's bounce here is only half the height of the previous bounce, right? So it dropped from 8 units high, and then when it bounces back up, it's only at 4 units. So when it's falling back down, we're going to make it so that it is not stretching as much. So let's reduce these values. Scale Y, we're just going to set to 1.15. We could say how about 1.2? We'll set scale X to 0.8 or an 8. There we go. So now our ball is stretching, but you can see that when we go back here, it's not stretching as much as when it was coming down. And again, you can play with these values to make it this 1.15. You can make this 0.85, 0.85. Just make sure that you're corresponding these change in scales by making the ball thinner when it gets taller and wider when it gets shorter. So our ball is falling back down, it is stretching. Here when it hits the ground, it has to squash again. So we'll go ahead and reduce those values. We'll set this to 0.85. We'll set the scale X to 1.2 and 1.2. Let's go ahead and set those to 1.15 and 1.15. So our ball is squashing, but if we go back here, you can see it's not squashing as much. Remember, you can just click in your timeline and you can click between frames. So we'll go back over here to frame 29. The ball is hitting the ground, it's pushing off, and it's going to explode back up. So let's see those values here. We have 1.15 and 0.85. Now, one of the cool things in Maya is you can use the time stall feature. In the timeline, if you have a key with values that you like on an object, you can middle mouse button click at frame 27, and you can drag along the timeline. And just when you release, you'll see there is no change, because what you're doing is you're sort of stalling time or copying the visuals from this one frame, and until you set another key or until you just scrub the timeline, everything is going to stay the same. So here at frame 27, you can drag it anywhere you want, and you have the opportunity to set those keys. So what I want is I want this stretch here as the ball is exploding back off the ground to match the stretch here as it's coming in. So let's go ahead and middle mouse button drag frame 27 to frame 29. And we'll just select our channels by clicking on Scale X and dragging down to Scale Z. We'll right click with our mouse and say Key Selected. And you can see that it made those keys. So now if I just scrub, I'm getting that stretch again. And we can use that technique for the rest of the ball bounce. So let's just go here to frame 43 right before it hits the ground. Now the ball is not bouncing very high, so it doesn't need to stretch very much. So we'll set this to 1.05. We'll set this to 0.9 and 0.9 or 0.95 and 0.95. And then here when the ball hits the ground, it's not going to stretch as much. So we'll say 0.95 and 1.05 and 1.05. So you see the corresponding change in the Z and the X axis from the change in the Y axis. And then we will middle mouse button click on frame 43, drag it to frame 45, select our scale channels, key selected. Now we're getting to the point where we don't really need to squash and stretch anymore, but let's just do one more bounce. We'll go ahead and we'll set that to right here, scale Y. We'll set that to 0.97, or pardon me, 1.03, and we'll set scale X to 0.97 and 0.97. We'll middle mouse button drag, we'll set those at frame 59. And then right here at frame 58, we'll change this to 0.97 and 1.03 and 1.03. So the ball is squashing, but again, it's not squashing as much as the previous bounce, which is not squashing as much as the previous bounce, which is not squashing as much as that bounce. So now if we play through the ball bounce, you'll see that we are getting some squash and stretch. Now again, in future tutorials, we'll talk about how we can accentuate that squash and stretch and how we can make that feel a little bit more pliable. But this is just so that you have the idea of how to institute squash and stretch on your ball bounce. So we've done the basics now. What we want to do is we want to go add some additional things, and that's why I added in the ball rotate. But before we do that, we got to go back up to the ball move, and what we want to do is we want to have the ball move across the scene. Right now it's just bouncing up and down in one axis. So what I want to do is I want to go over here, and when I try to move this, watch, I'll try to move in this x-axis because that's the axis that I'm going to move in. You'll see that it actually moves it and it creates a change in our curve down here. But because I've gone and I've set some extra keys, it's keeping that change in distance only for the distance between these first two keys. So what I have to do is I have to kind of reset this translate X. Let's go ahead and set this back to 0. And what you can do is if your channel is empty or it doesn't have any type of animation to it, you can go here to Edit, Delete by Type, and Static Channels. And what you'll see is because I only have animation on the vertical axis, it actually doesn't have any other channels that are keyed, so it'll delete the animation on all of those channels. Now that's handy, but I want to be specific about this, so we'll just go ahead over to Translate X and I'll show you a different method. You can actually say Break Connections here by right-clicking on that Translate X, and that will just kill the keys on that one curve. And that'll do that regardless of whether or not there's animation on that. That's basically just getting rid of the animation on one channel. So at frame 0 here, we're going to set a key for Translate X. And what I want is over the length of the ball bounce, it's going to move from here all the way over here to the side of the screen. So let's go ahead and scrub our animation all the way over to frame 72, which is the last frame of our animation. And I'm going to drag the ball right over here. And you'll see because I've set a key for Translate X at the very beginning of the animation, that when I move it, it's automatically setting that key. So now my ball is moving and rotating. There you go, or moving across the scene, which is the way that I want it. Now one of the problems is that the ball is sort of starting out slowly here. And what I really want is I want this motion at the beginning to be a little bit faster. So I'm just going to go ahead and select this first key, and I'm going to set these tangents to linear. You'll remember in our ball bounce, when the ball is hitting the ground, it's an explosive motion, so we set it to linear. We're going to do the same thing here, but it's not because it's an explosive motion, it's because we want this ball moving at sort of a constant rate at the beginning. So we'll go ahead and set that to linear, and you can see now that it makes the curve straight at the beginning, and then as it gets to the end and the ball loses that momentum, it starts to stop, right? The ball loses that and it stops. So this is cool, but it doesn't look very good that the ball is not rotating. So that's why we added in the ball rotate feature down here. And then the ball rotate is beneath squash and stretch. If I were to go to the ball move and I were to go to any key and I were to rotate it, because it is above in the hierarchy, you can see that when I do that, it's actually rotating the ball in its squash and stretch form, which is not what we want. We actually want the ball to rotate underneath that squash and stretch. So that's why we added this component to our hierarchy. What we'll do is we'll go to frame 0, we'll set a key on ball rotate, and we'll click on ball move, and we'll see, okay, 72 is our last frame. We'll go over here to ball rotate, and we'll go ahead and we'll set that key. Now you got to kind of estimate this. There are ways to mathematically do it with a measurement tool, but we'll just go ahead and estimate it. I think the ball is going to rotate probably, let's just say 3 times. So right now I've got my axis up, my rotate, and you can see that if I select any one of these axes, I can rotate only in that axis, which is really good. And I can see that my z-axis, or the blue axis, is the one that the ball is going to be rotating in. So the ball is moving in this direction. We want it to be rotating in this direction as well. So if I go to rotate Z, I can type 360. That is a full rotation. And what we want is we want 3 rotations. So we'll do 720, which is 2 rotations, and then we'll do 1080, which is 3 rotations. So if I go over here in my graph editor, I can see now I've created a rotation that is on the rotate Z. And you can see that this curve looks the same as the movement did on our ball move. So let's just go ahead and see how that looks. So you can see it's looking pretty good, but it seems like it's maybe rotating a little bit fast here at the end. What we want to do is we want to do the same thing we did with those keys on the movement. We want the ball to be rotating consistently at the beginning. So we'll go ahead and select this first key and we'll set it to a linear tangent. Now you can see the ball is rotating. It's getting most of its rotation here. And then at the end, it's sort of rotating right there. So what we want is, maybe from a visual standpoint, we don't want it to be just sort of straight up and down. Maybe we want that to be a little bit off. So we'll go ahead and instead of at 1080, we'll just set this to like 1200. So now you can see the ball ends and it's not any straight up and down. So that's visually a little bit more appealing. And when we look at it, the ball looks like it's rotating correctly. Okay. It's sort of hitting the ground and it's rotating. And the last thing we're going to do is we're just going to add a little bit of a rock back, okay? And when we add a little bit of a rock back, what that's going to do is it's just going to make our animation just a little bit more appealing. So instead of just stopping here at the end, we're going to go ahead and add just a little bit of rotation back and rotation back to where it is now. So go ahead and set this to 85 frames and we'll drag this out. And then we'll go ahead to frame 85, and with ball rotate and ball move selected, we'll go ahead and we'll set a key. And what I want to do is I want to just make one key in between here at frame 78 where my ball rotates back just a little bit. And I'm going to take this ball move here and I'm just going to move it back just a little bit. We'll just eyeball this. Again, there are different ways to do this. We could add another node in our hierarchy. But what I'm doing is I'm saying the ball is kind of stopping and it's rotating back. We'll just kind of play around with this, so maybe it doesn't move back quite as much. So we'll go ahead and select these keys. We'll hit F, we'll zoom in, and we'll just take this so that it doesn't move quite as much. We'll go over to ball rotate, we'll select this key, hit F. Maybe it doesn't rotate back as much, but we've got just a little bit of motion where the ball is rotating back. And I think I need to accentuate this just a little bit. Just have it so the ball is there, and then the ball kind of rocks to a stop. So there's plenty of things that we can do to make this aesthetically more pleasing, but let's just go ahead and check if the ball is looking correct now. All right, so there you've got your ball rotating to a stop. And let's just go ahead and add a couple of frames here at the end. This is one thing that's really important with an animation. When you end, you don't want to end right at the end of your motion. Give the eye a little bit more time to settle. So we'll just go ahead and set this to 100 frames. We'll drag this out to 100. We'll go back. We'll say play. Let's just see what happens. Our ball rotates to a stop. All right, so right now looks like my rotation is just a little bit fast. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select my ball move and my ball rotate. And I'm just going to select these keys. Now, I can move keys around in the graph editor or in the channel or in the time slider. In the time slider, what I can do is I can click and I can hold down shift, and it creates this little like blue area. The middle arrows allow me to move. So what I'm going to do, if you remember from our ball bounce, is I'm just going to move these keys out. And by moving them out, I'm extending the time, making it a slower action. Same thing here with these last keys. Remember, I have multiple objects selected, so I'm moving the keys for both of those objects. So now if I play through, all right, there you go. So now my ball looks like it's rotating to a stop pretty nicely. And you have a ball bounce that has squash and stretch, rotation, and movement. All right, if you got any questions, go ahead and drop me a comment down in the comments section and let me know if there's anything else I can help you with. Please drop a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you on the next tutorial. Thanks.